The night was an impenetrable void, its silence broken only by the distant hum of Diego's car engine as he drove along a narrow, winding road. His headlights cut through a dense fog that clung to the landscape like a shroud, revealing nothing but skeletal trees and stretches of cracked asphalt. Just as his fuel gauge dipped perilously close to empty, his eyes caught a glimpse of something ahead, a decrepit wooden sign, its letters faded but still legible, "Lost Way in Vacancy." The sign swayed unnaturally in the still air, as if unseen hands were urging him forward. With no other options, Diego turned onto the gravel path leading to the inn, his stomach twisting in unease as the road seemed to close behind him, swallowed by the encroaching mist. The inn loomed ahead like a shadow brought to life. Its gabled roof clawed at the heavens, and its windows were pitch black, resembling unblinking eyes that watched his every move. The gravel crunched beneath his tires, the sound unnervingly loud in the suffocating quiet. As Diego parked, his breath fogged up the windshield, obscuring his view for just a moment. When the condensation cleared, he saw it, what looked like a figure standing by the inn's front door. But in the blink of an eye, it vanished, leaving him staring at an empty porch. A sense of wrongness hung heavy in the air as he stepped out of the car. The cold was biting, almost unnatural for the season, and the stillness of the place was deafening. Even the trees seemed frozen in time, their branches twisted into grotesque shapes. As he approached the building, the creaking of the wooden steps beneath his weight sent shivers up his spine. His hand hesitated on the doorknob, which felt icy despite the warmth of his palm. When he finally pushed the door open, it let out a groan that echoed into the dark void of the inn. The interior was worse than he had imagined. Dust blanketed every surface, and cobwebs draped the corners like sinister decorations. A grand chandelier hung precariously above the lobby, its once glorious crystals now dull and tarnished. The light it emitted flickered, casting long, dancing shadows across the room. In the dim light, Diego noticed a guest book resting on the reception desk. The pages were yellowed and torn, but what unnerved him most was that the pen beside it seemed freshly used, ink dripping as if someone had just written their name. As he moved deeper into the lobby, his footsteps echoed unnaturally, as though the sound was being stretched and distorted by something unseen. A sudden, sharp noise shattered the oppressive silence, a whisper, faint and fleeting, but unmistakable. "Diego, it wasn't a call. It was a warning." He spun around, his heart pounding, but saw nothing. Only the shadowed corners seemed to shift, almost imperceptibly. He told himself it was exhaustion playing tricks on his mind, but as he glanced toward the staircase at the back of the room, he froze. The stairs led into an abyss of darkness, their edges fading into a void that seemed to consume light itself. And then he saw it, just for a split second, a hand, pale and skeletal, slipping out of sight behind the banister. The air grew colder, and an almost imperceptible vibration seemed to pulse through the room, as if the inn itself were alive, breathing, waiting. Diego's instincts screamed at him to leave, but when he turned back toward the door, his heart sank. The road he had come from was gone, replaced by an endless sea of fog that pressed against the windows like a living thing. The car was no longer visible, as if the inn had swallowed it whole. His throat tightened, and a wave of dread washed over him. There was no turning back. The lost way in had him now, and it wasn't letting go. The air inside the inn was thick, almost oppressive, as if every breath Diego took was weighted by unseen eyes watching from the shadows. He wandered cautiously through the dimly lit hallway, his shoes sinking into the threadbare carpet that muffled his every step. The walls were adorned with faded portraits, their subjects' faces blurred, yet their hollow eyes seemed to follow him. At the end of the hall, he noticed a faint glow coming from an open doorway, spilling pale light into the suffocating darkness. Drawn by a pull he couldn't explain, Diego approached the room, the light flickering as though it were alive, pulsing in sync with the pounding of his heart. Inside, the room was a strange contradiction, completely barren except for a lone rocking chair that sat in the center, creaking rhythmically, though no one was there to move it. On the floor beneath the chair lay something small and inconspicuous, yet it caught Diego's attention like a beacon in the night. As he stepped closer, his blood ran cold. It was a toy car, battered and rusted, but unmistakable. The same toy he had been clutching in his hand the night of the accident that had scarred his childhood forever. Memories flooded back unbidden, overwhelming his senses. He saw the rain pounding against the windshield, heard the screech of tires as his father tried to swerve, and felt the jarring impact as their car collided with something on that very same road. He had been too young to fully understand what had happened, but the image of his father slumped over the steering wheel, blood pooling on the dashboard, had haunted him ever since. Diego's hand trembled as he picked up the toy car. The moment his fingers touched the cold metal, the room seemed to shift. The walls warped and rippled, their peeling wallpaper dissolving to reveal images etched into the wood beneath, scenes from the accident. He saw himself as a child, standing in the rain, staring at something on the side of the road. But the memory was wrong, distorted. In the etching, he wasn't alone. A dark figure loomed behind his younger self, its elongated hand resting lightly on his shoulder. Diego staggered back, his breathing shallow as he tried to rationalize the impossible. A sound broke through the rising panic, a low hum, almost melodic, drifting from somewhere deeper in the inn. It was faint at first but grew louder, clearer. It was a tune he hadn't heard in years, his mother's lullaby, sung to him when he was afraid of the dark. The haunting melody wrapped around him, both comforting and sinister, as though it were beckoning him further. The hallway outside the room was now cloaked in shadow, but the lullaby seemed to guide him, compelling him to move despite the dread pooling in his stomach. As he followed the sound, he noticed a faint trail of muddy footprints leading down another corridor. They were too small to be his, and yet they were familiar, as if he had walked that path before. At the end of the trail was a door, slightly ajar, with the lullaby spilling out like a siren's call. Diego pushed it open with trembling hands, revealing what appeared to be a child's bedroom frozen in time. The walls were painted with whimsical stars and moons, but their colors had faded to a sickly gray. A crib sat in the corner, its bars warped and broken, and the air reeked of mildew and something far worse. On the bed lay a blanket he recognized instantly. It was his own from childhood, embroidered with his name in uneven stitches. As he stepped closer, he saw that the name had been crudely crossed out, replaced with another, Lost. Suddenly, the lullaby stopped, and the silence that followed was deafening. Diego turned, sensing he was no longer alone. In the corner of the room, the shadows coalesced into a figure, a childlike silhouette with hollow eyes and a mouth that gaped too wide, as if screaming silently. The figure raised a hand, pointing at the toy car in Diego's grasp. Its movements were jerky, unnatural, as though it were being controlled by invisible strings. The walls of the room began to close in, the painted stars turning black and dripping down like ink. The air grew colder, and Diego's breath fogged in front of him. The figure took a step forward, its hollow eyes locking onto his. It didn't speak, but its presence screamed volumes. This was a manifestation of his past, something he had buried deep and now could no longer ignore. Diego clutched the toy car tighter, desperate for some anchor to reality. But as he looked down, he saw his hands were no longer his own. They were smaller, the hands of a child, smeared with mud and blood. The figure's wide mouth curved into something resembling a smile, and the room went black, plunging him into a void where only the echoes of the lullaby remained, wrapping around him like chains. Diego stumbled out of the child's bedroom, his legs unsteady as though the floor beneath him threatened to give way. The shadows along the hallway seemed to stretch and writhe, no longer content to remain dormant. The air was thick, suffocating, and carried a faint metallic tang, like the scent of blood lingering in an unseen corner. As he reached the staircase, a new sound emerged, a low, rhythmic knocking, deliberate and menacing, echoing from below. It called to him, pulling at his very core, and though every instinct screamed at him to turn back, Diego found his feet moving of their own accord, descending into the unknown. The knocking led him to a door he hadn't noticed before, hidden behind an ornate tapestry. Its surface was ancient, scarred with deep claw marks and riddled with symbols that made his skin crawl just by looking at them. He hesitated, his hand trembling as he reached for the handle. The moment he touched it, the knocking ceased, replaced by a soft whisper, a voice that was eerily familiar. It was his mother's voice, calm and soothing, calling him by the nickname she had used when he was a child. Diaguinho, open the door, Corrido. The tenderness in her tone was undercut by something darker, a subtle distortion that sent shivers racing down his spine. When he pushed the door open, Diego was met with a room that defied explanation. The walls were lined with mirrors of varying sizes, their frames ornate but tarnished, as if they had been plucked from different eras. Each mirror reflected not the room, but fragments of Diego's life, moments he had long forgotten or buried. In one, he saw himself as a boy, sitting by his father's hospital bed, tears streaming down his face. In another, he stood as a teenager, arguing with his mother over something trivial, the guilt of her disappointed gaze palpable even now. At the center of the room stood a pedestal, and upon it rested a small box, unassuming yet pulsating faintly with an eerie glow. As Diego approached, a figure stepped out from the shadows, a tall, gaunt man in a suit that seemed to shift and shimmer, as though woven from the fabric of nightmares. His face was pale, his features sharp and angular, but his eyes, they were pits of darkness, voids that seemed to consume everything they looked upon. "You've made it this far," the man said, his voice smooth and cold like steel. "But now comes the real test." He gestured toward the box, his thin lips curling into a sinister smile. "Inside lies your way out. But nothing comes without a price." Diego's voice cracked as he managed to whisper, "What price?" The man tilted his head, the smile widening unnaturally. "A memory," he replied. "But not just any memory. I want the one you cherish most. The moment that defines who you are, the one that gives you strength when all else fails. Surrender it, and the door will open. Refuse, and you stay." Diego's chest tightened as the gravity of the choice sank in. His mind raced, instinctively clinging to the memory of his mother, who had passed away years earlier. He saw her face clearly now, the warmth of her smile, the way her eyes crinkled at the corners when she laughed. It was the memory he turned to in his darkest moments, a reminder that he had been loved unconditionally. "No," Diego said, shaking his head. "There has to be another way." The man's expression darkened, and the mirrors around the room began to tremble. The reflections twisted and warped, the scenes within them growing grotesque. In one, Diego saw his childhood self reaching for his mother, only for her to dissolve into ash. In another, he saw himself as he was now, standing frozen in terror as the figure behind him grew closer, its long fingers stretching toward his neck. "There is no other way," the man hissed, his voice now layered with other tones, deeper, guttural, and inhuman. "Choose, or the inn will choose for you." Tears blurred Diego's vision as he stared at the box. The glow grew brighter, almost blinding, and the whispers in the room became deafening, a cacophony of voices begging, pleading, and mocking him all at once. He wanted to scream, to run, but the door he had entered through was gone, replaced by another mirror reflecting his terrified face. Finally, with trembling hands, he reached for the box. As his fingers touched the lid, a surge of cold shot through his body, and he felt the memory begin to slip away. He tried to hold on to it, the sound of his mother's laughter, the warmth of her embrace, but it was like grasping at smoke. The man's smile widened, and the shadows in the room seemed to grow darker, more oppressive. When the lid opened, Diego was engulfed in a blinding light. The whispers stopped, replaced by a deafening silence that pressed against his ears. He stumbled backward, clutching his head as the memory evaporated completely, leaving behind an aching void. The room shifted again, the mirrors cracking and falling away like shards of a broken reality. In their place stood a single door, its surface pristine and glowing faintly. Diego stared at it, his heart heavy with the weight of what he had lost. He didn't remember why, but he knew something precious had been taken from him, a piece of himself he could never get back. As he stepped through the door, the man's voice echoed behind him, cold and mocking. "You've paid your price, but remember, no one truly leaves the lost way in." Diego passed through the glowing door, hoping for freedom, but instead found himself in a corridor that seemed to stretch endlessly in both directions. The walls were made of cold, wet stone, glistening as if sweat dripped from the very pores of the building. The air was heavy, laden with the scent of decay and damp earth, and his breath hung visibly in front of him, each exhalation echoing faintly into the dark void ahead. As he moved forward, the sound of his footsteps seemed distorted, as though someone, or something, was walking in sync behind him. He paused, turning sharply, but there was nothing there. Only the corridor stretched into darkness, the shadows almost vibrating with an unseen energy. Then faintly he heard it, a whisper so soft that it was almost drowned out by the beating of his own heart. It wasn't just a single voice, it was many, layered atop one another, speaking in a language he couldn't understand. The cadence was hypnotic, like an ancient chant meant to summon something long forgotten. "Hello!" Diego's voice cracked as he called out, his words swallowed by the oppressive silence that followed the whispers. A cold breeze licked the back of his neck, sending a chill down his spine. He turned again, feeling as though eyes were boring into him from the darkness. But the corridor remained empty, the shadows mocking him with their stillness. He quickened his pace, the whispers growing louder with every step. They seemed to bleed out of the walls, their tones shifting between urgent and mocking, sometimes calling his name, other times devolving into guttural, inhuman sounds. The corridor began to change, subtly at first, shadows deepened, and the walls grew uneven, as if they were warping under some unseen pressure. Then came the shapes. At the edge of his vision, Diego began to see figures. They darted in and out of the corners, fleeting and indistinct, their forms amorphous and shifting. He stopped in his tracks as one of them stepped forward, just enough to be seen, a humanoid shape, but wrong in every way. Its arms were too long, its head tilted unnaturally to one side, and its body seemed to flicker like an old film reel. Diego backed away, his heartbeat thunderous in his ears. "Stay back," he shouted, though his voice barely carried in the suffocating air. The figure didn't move closer but raised an arm, its skeletal hand pointing toward a door that hadn't been there before. The door was carved from dark wood, its surface etched with symbols similar to those on the hidden door earlier. But this one was far worse. The carvings seemed alive, shifting and writhing like worms burrowing through the wood. The whispers reached a crescendo as Diego approached the door. His hand trembled as he touched the handle, cold and slick as if covered in sweat. The moment he turned it, the door creaked open, and the whispers ceased. The silence that followed was almost more terrifying, a vacuum that pressed against his ears, making him feel as though he were underwater. Inside, the room was pitch black except for a faint, pulsating glow emanating from the center. Diego stepped forward hesitantly, the floor beneath him soft and uneven, like flesh rather than stone. The glow revealed its source, a pool of inky black liquid, thick and viscous, reflecting distorted images on its surface. As he peered into it, his breath hitched. The pool didn't reflect his face. Instead, it showed scenes from his life, twisted and wrong. He saw himself standing over his father's hospital bed, but this time, his hands were stained with blood. He saw his mother in tears, but her face was blurred, her cries distorted into a grotesque wail. And then he saw himself, standing in this very room, staring into the pool, but with a shadow looming behind him. Diego spun around, but the room was empty. The pulsating glow grew stronger, casting flickering light on the walls, which were now covered in handprints, small, childlike, but smeared with something dark and wet. The whispers returned, louder now, but instead of incomprehensible murmurs, they formed words that chilled him to his core. "Let us in," they hissed, overlapping in a cacophony that made his head throb. "You took what was ours. Let us in." Diego clutched his head, falling to his knees as the shadows in the room seemed to converge, circling him like predators. The pool bubbled violently, and from its depths emerged a figure, a grotesque amalgamation of faces and limbs, its form constantly shifting as though it couldn't decide what it wanted to be. The whispers grew louder, echoing inside his skull, and Diego realized they weren't coming from the room anymore, they were inside him. The figure reached out a hand, impossibly long and skeletal, its claw-like fingers inches from his face. "Choose," it rasped, its voice an otherworldly blend of many. "Open yourself to us, or remain here forever." Diego's mind raced. The pool seemed to ripple in time with his thoughts, showing visions of what awaited him if he stayed. His body wasting away, his reflection in the mirrors becoming just another trapped soul, forever part of the whispers. But the alternative was equally horrifying. To surrender himself to whatever malevolent force waited just beyond the veil. To let it take him and hope it didn't consume him entirely. As the shadows pressed closer, Diego knew he was out of time. Whatever he chose, there would be no turning back. The inn wanted more than just his memories now. It wanted his very soul. Diego's breathing was ragged as he stumbled back from the bubbling pool, its rippling surface still distorting the fragments of his past into grotesque, haunting images. The whispers had grown softer, almost seductive, as if the shadows were trying to lull him into surrender. His thoughts felt fractured, like shards of a broken mirror, each reflecting his deepest fears. The room around him seemed alive, its walls pulsating faintly, as though the inn itself were breathing. A cold sweat trickled down his spine as he felt something brush against his arm, light, fleeting, like a spider's touch. He whipped around, but no one was there. Instead, the room had changed again. The pool was gone, replaced by a staircase spiraling downward into a darkness so absolute it seemed to swallow the faint glow that surrounded him. The air grew colder with each passing second, and with it came the sensation of being watched, of countless unseen eyes boring into his every move. Somewhere in the distance, a low, mournful hum began to echo, a sound that resonated deep in his chest, like the groan of a dying creature. As he descended the staircase, the whispers returned, this time louder and more distinct. They didn't speak in unison anymore. Instead, they competed for his attention, each voice more desperate than the last. "Don't go," one voice pleaded, trembling with emotion. Turn back before it's too late. Another voice, darker and filled with venom, hissed, "You're already ours." There's no escape. The darkness at the bottom of the staircase was oppressive, like a thick, living fog that clung to his skin. Diego fumbled for his phone, hoping to use its flashlight, but the screen remained stubbornly dark, refusing to turn on. "Of course," he muttered bitterly, his voice cracking under the weight of his fear. He reached out blindly, his fingers brushing against something solid. It was a door, smooth and cold, with no visible handle. As he pressed his palm against it, the whispers ceased, replaced by a low, rhythmic thumping. It sounded like a heartbeat, slow and deliberate, coming from somewhere beyond the door. Diego's own heart seemed to sync with it, each beat louder and more frantic as the door swung open on its own. The room beyond was vast and empty, a void stretching farther than his eyes could see. But in the center of the darkness stood a single chair, illuminated by a faint spotlight. Diego hesitated, his instincts screaming at him to turn back, but his legs carried him forward as though pulled by invisible strings. As he approached, he realized the chair wasn't empty. A figure sat slumped over, its head tilted at an unnatural angle. The body was gaunt and pale, its skin stretched taut over its bones. Diego froze as he recognized the tattered clothes, the same ones he was wearing. The figure slowly lifted its head, revealing his own face staring back at him, but twisted in agony. Its eyes were hollow voids, and its mouth stretched into a grotesque grin. "You've been here before," the doppelganger rasped, its voice a hollow echo of his own. "Do you remember?" Diego shook his head violently, backing away. "No, that's not me. That's not possible." The figure stood, its movements jerky and inhuman, as though it were a marionette controlled by unseen hands. "It's always been you," it whispered, stepping closer. "You've tried to leave, but the end doesn't let go. It never lets go." Diego's back hit an invisible wall, trapping him as the figure closed the distance. Shadows began to swirl around them, forming faces, twisted, screaming faces that melted into one another. He tried to shut his eyes, but the images burned into his mind. Each face seemed familiar, though he couldn't place them, as if they were fragments of forgotten dreams. "Fear is the key," the doppelganger said, its grin widening impossibly. "The more you feed it, the stronger the end becomes. It's why you're here, Diego. It's why you've always been here." The shadows pressed closer, and Diego felt his grip on reality slipping. His surroundings began to blur, the faces in the darkness merging with his own memories, his father's death, his mother's tears, the accident on the road. Each moment replayed in grotesque detail, warped and exaggerated until they were almost unrecognizable. The inn wasn't just showing him his fears, it was amplifying them, feeding on his terror like a parasite. The whispers returned, more insistent than ever. "Give in," they urged. "It will hurt less if you stop fighting." Diego dropped to his knees, clutching his head as the voices grew deafening. He could feel his resolve crumbling, the weight of his fear threatening to crush him entirely. But then, in the midst of the chaos, he heard a single voice, soft, steady, and familiar. "Diego," it said, cutting through the cacophony like a knife. "Remember who you are." The shadows recoiled slightly, as though the voice had burned them. Diego's mind latched onto it, his breathing slowing as he focused. It was his mother's voice, clear and unwavering, pulling him back from the brink. He opened his eyes, and the doppelganger was gone. The swirling shadows had stilled, their faces fading into the darkness. For the first time, Diego felt a flicker of defiance. The fear was still there, heavy and oppressive, but he refused to let it consume him. As he stood, the room began to shift, the darkness peeling away like layers of old paint. But the inn wasn't done with him yet, and Diego knew his fight was far from over. Diego felt the air grow heavier as the shadows receded, leaving behind an ominous silence. The room seemed to stretch and contract, as though it were breathing, alive in its own malevolent way. He stood frozen, his pulse racing as the flicker of defiance he'd felt moments ago began to waver. Then, from the far corner of the room, a sound broke the silence, a slow, deliberate scraping, like nails dragging across stone. He turned toward the noise, his heart pounding in his chest. A doorway emerged from the darkness, framed by the faint glow of sickly green light seeping through the cracks. The light pulsed rhythmically like a heartbeat, casting eerie shadows that danced across the walls. Diego's instincts screamed at him to stay away, but he couldn't ignore the magnetic pull drawing him forward. Whatever was behind that door was the source of everything, the whispers, the shadows, the inn itself. As he stepped closer, the door creaked open on its own, revealing a vast, circular chamber. The walls were lined with grotesque carvings, depicting scenes of torment and sacrifice. Figures were etched into the stone, their faces contorted in eternal agony, as if they had been frozen mid-scream. At the center of the room stood a massive, ornate mirror, its frame twisted and jagged, like branches of a tree corrupted by some unnatural force. The glass shimmered unnaturally, reflecting not Diego's image, but the horrors he had witnessed, the shadowy doppelganger, the bubbling pool, the twisted memories of his past. Diego's breath caught as the mirror began to ripple, its surface distorting like water disturbed by an unseen hand. From within, a figure emerged, stepping out as though crossing a threshold between worlds. It was the same man he'd seen earlier, the gaunt figure in the shifting suit, with eyes like endless voids. But now, his presence was far more oppressive, his form radiating a darkness that seemed to drain the air from the room. "You've come so far, Diego," the man said, his voice reverberating unnaturally, as though layered with 1,000 echoes. "But this is where it all ends. What do you want from me?" Diego demanded, his voice trembling despite his attempt to sound strong. The man tilted his head, a cruel smile playing on his lips. "It's not about what I want. It's about what you fear." He gestured toward the mirror, and its surface rippled again, revealing a scene that made Diego's blood run cold. He saw himself, standing in his childhood home. The room was dark, but the faint glow of a fire illuminated his mother, sitting in her favorite chair. Her face was pale, her expression hollow, and her eyes, they were black voids, just like the man's. She turned toward the reflection, her lips parting to speak, but her voice was twisted and wrong. "You let me die, Diego," she whispered, her tone laced with both sorrow and accusation. Diego staggered back, shaking his head violently. "No, that's not true." The man laughed, the sound cold and cruel. "The truth doesn't matter here. What matters is what you believe. And deep down, you believe you failed her. That guilt is why you're here. It's why the end chose you." The shadows in the room began to swirl, converging around the mirror as the scene changed again. This time, Diego saw himself on the night of the accident, standing by the wreckage of the car. In the reflection, his younger self wasn't crying or scared. Instead, he was smiling, his eyes filled with malice as he watched the flames consume the vehicle. "No," Diego whispered, tears streaming down his face. "That's not real. That's not who I am." The man stepped closer, his smile widening unnaturally. "Isn't it?" he asked. "The end doesn't lie, Diego. It reveals the truth you've tried so desperately to hide. But you don't have to run anymore. Embrace it. Accept who you are, and the pain will end." The shadows around the mirror began to take shape, forming figures that resembled the carvings on the walls. They moved closer to Diego, their hollow eyes fixated on him, their skeletal hands outstretched. He could feel their cold, oppressive presence, their whispers filling his mind, urging him to give in. Diego fell to his knees, clutching his head as the voices grew louder. The mirror's surface shimmered again, and this time, it showed him an image of himself, older, gaunt, and lifeless, trapped within the glass. "This is your future," the man said, his tone almost sympathetic. "Unless you make a choice." Diego looked up, his eyes wide with terror. "What choice?" The man extended his hand, and a key materialized in his palm. It was ornate, its surface etched with the same shifting symbols that adorn the inn's walls. "Unlock the mirror," he said. "Step through, and you'll be free. But freedom comes at a cost." "What cost?" Diego asked, though he already knew the answer. The man's smile turned sinister. "Your soul, of course. But what use is a soul weighed down by guilt and fear? Give it to me, and the pain will stop. You'll finally find peace." Diego's hands trembled as he reached for the key. The shadows around him pressed closer, their whispers growing frantic, both urging and warning him. The mirror's surface rippled again, showing a scene of tranquility, a sunlit meadow, a place of peace and freedom. But as Diego stared deeper, he saw the truth beneath the surface. The meadow was a facade, hiding an endless void of darkness and despair. Tears blurred his vision as he pulled his hand back, clutching his chest. "No," he said, his voice barely above a whisper. "I won't give you what you want." The man's expression darkened, his eyes narrowing. "Then you've sealed your fate," he hissed. The shadows surged forward, their hands clawing at Diego, pulling him toward the mirror. But as they dragged him closer, Diego felt a spark of defiance reignite within him. Summoning every ounce of strength he had left, he reached into his pocket and pulled out the toy car, the last remnant of his past, the symbol of his guilt and pain. With a cry of determination, he hurled it at the mirror. The glass shattered on impact, the the room erupting into a blinding light as the shadows screamed and dissolved into nothingness. When the light faded, Diego found himself alone, the ornate mirror reduced to shards at his feet. The man was gone, and the oppressive weight of the inn seemed to lift. But Diego knew the fight wasn't over. The inn had let him go, but its whispers lingered, a chilling reminder that it was always watching, waiting for him to fall again. The air crackled with tension as Diego stood amidst the shattered remains of the mirror. The fragments glimmered faintly in the dim light, each shard reflecting distorted versions of his face, some frightened, others twisted in rage, and one that bore a cruel smile that didn't belong to him. The room was eerily quiet, as if the inn itself were holding its breath, waiting for his next move. But Diego knew better than to trust the silence. A low rumble began to rise, distant at first but growing louder, vibrating through the very walls. It wasn't the sound of the inn collapsing. It was something alive, something immense and angry, stirring in the depths of the building. The glow from the shattered mirror began to coalesce, the fragments lifting into the air and reforming, but not as a mirror. This time, they formed a doorway, their jagged edges pulsating with an otherworldly light. The whispers returned, louder and more chaotic than ever, voices overlapping and clashing as they filled Diego's mind. Some begged him to run, others demanded he step through the doorway, while a few simply laughed, their tones mocking and cruel. "You've broken the mirror," one voice hissed, cold and venomous. "But you haven't broken us." Diego clenched his fists, his nails digging into his palms as he forced himself to move. He approached the doorway, each step feeling heavier than the last. The air grew colder, and the light from the portal flickered erratically, casting long, shifting shadows across the chamber. Just as he reached the threshold, a figure emerged from the light. It was the gaunt man, his form more monstrous now. His limbs were unnaturally long, his hands ending in claws that scraped against the ground as he moved. His face was no longer human, his mouth stretched impossibly wide, lined with rows of jagged teeth, and his eyes burned like twin voids, radiating malice. He towered over Diego, his presence suffocating. "You think you've won?" the creature growled, its voice reverberating through the room like a chorus of damned souls. "You've merely awakened the inn's true nature. It doesn't let anyone go, Diego. Not without a final price." The room darkened further as the shadows began to writhe, forming figures that circled Diego. They were the faces from the carvings on the walls, the trapped souls of the inn, their expressions twisted in eternal torment. They reached for him, their hands translucent yet cold as ice, their touch draining him of strength. Diego stumbled backward, his heart racing. "I won't give you anything else," he shouted, his voice cracking but defiant. "You've taken enough." The creature tilted its head, mockingly amused. "We don't need to take, Diego," it said, its voice now a soft, sinister whisper. "You'll give it willingly. You always do. Fear makes you weak. Guilt makes you ours." The shadows surged, their clawed hands reaching for Diego, their whispers now deafening. He felt himself being dragged toward the portal, the light burning brighter as the creature's laughter echoed around him. His mind was a whirlwind of terror and regret, every mistake, every moment of pain flashing before his eyes. But then, amidst the chaos, he heard it again, the faint, steady voice of his mother. "You are stronger than this, Diego," it said, cutting through the cacophony like a beacon. "Remember who you are. Remember what matters." The words reignited the flicker of defiance within him, and Diego's gaze snapped to the fragments of the mirror still scattered on the ground. They shimmered faintly, as if calling to him. He reached for one, ignoring the icy hands clawing at his skin, and gripped the shard tightly. Its edge cut into his palm, blood dripping onto the floor, but the pain grounded him. He turned toward the creature, the shard clutched in his trembling hand. "You feed on fear and guilt," Diego said, his voice gaining strength. "But you don't control me. Not anymore." The creature snarled, its form flickering as though destabilized. The shadows hesitated, their grip weakening as Diego stepped forward. With a surge of determination, he plunged the shard into the center of the doorway. The light exploded outward, blinding and searing, as the portal began to collapse. The creature let out an ear-piercing scream, its body twisting and writhing as the light consumed it. The shadows dissolved, their anguished cries fading into silence. The room trembled violently, the carvings on the walls splitting and crumbling as the inn began to collapse in on itself. Diego stumbled away from the collapsing portal, his vision blurry from the intense light. He didn't stop running, even as the floor beneath him cracked and shifted. The whispers were gone, replaced by a deafening silence that seemed almost peaceful. Finally, He reached a staircase that spiraled upward, its steps illuminated by a faint, warm glow. He climbed, his legs burning with effort, until he burst through a door into the open air. The night was quiet, the stars above glimmering like diamonds against the darkness. He turned to look back, but the inn was gone, replaced by an empty stretch of road. Diego fell to his knees, his chest heaving as he gasped for air. The toy car was still in his pocket, its edges warm against his skin. He didn't know if he was truly free, or if the inn would find a way to pull him back. But for now, the weight of its presence was gone, and the whispers were silent. As he stood and began to walk down the road, the faint echo of laughter reached his ears, carried on the wind. He didn't look back. He couldn't. Deep down, he knew the inn wasn't finished with him. It never would be. Diego trudged down the empty road, his steps uneven, his body weighed down by exhaustion and the lingering chill of the inn. The silence around him was oppressive, unnatural, as if the world itself were holding its breath. The stars above twinkled faintly, but their light seemed cold, distant, offering no comfort. The night felt endless, the road stretching ahead into a void that seemed to lead nowhere. He clutched the toy car in his pocket, its once familiar presence now a source of unease. He couldn't shake the feeling that something was wrong. Though he had escaped the inn, its mark lingered. He could feel it in the way the shadows along the roadside seemed to shift, watching him. The whispering had stopped, but the silence it left behind felt heavier, like an unfinished sentence waiting to be spoken. Diego glanced over his shoulder for the 100th time, half expecting to see the gaunt man, his hollow eyes staring back at him. But the road behind him was empty, swallowed by darkness. The memory of the inn played over and over in his mind. The bubbling pool, the mirror, the creature's voice, all of it felt too vivid, too real to be left behind. And yet, it was fading. His thoughts felt disjointed, as though pieces of the experience were being pulled away, erased. He tried to remember the faces he had seen in the shadows, the voices that had spoken to him, but they slipped through his grasp like sand. A deep unease settled in his chest. What had he truly escaped from? Ahead, Diego noticed a faint glow, a warm golden light spilling onto the road from an unseen source. Hope stirred in him, a sign of civilization, perhaps a chance to rest and recover. As he approached, the glow resolved into a gas station, its lone pump standing beneath a flickering neon sign that read, "Last Stop." The building itself was small and dilapidated, its windows smudged with grime. Diego hesitated at the edge of the lot, his instincts prickling. Something about the gas station felt familiar. The layout, the flickering light, even the distant hum of the fluorescent sign, it all pulled at the edges of his memory, though he couldn't place why. Shaking off the feeling, he stepped inside, the bell above the door jangling weakly. The interior was sparse, lined with dusty shelves stocked with outdated snacks and drinks. Behind the counter stood an elderly man, his face lined with wrinkles that seemed carved into his skin. His eyes, however, were sharp, gleaming with an intensity that made Diego's stomach churn. "Long night?" the man asked, his voice rough and gravelly. Diego nodded, his throat dry. "Yeah, I got lost." The man's gaze lingered on Diego for a moment too long before he smiled, a thin, unsettling smile that didn't reach his eyes. "You're not the first," he said, sliding a cup of coffee across the counter. "On the house. You'll need it." Diego took the cup hesitantly, the warmth of the liquid doing little to ease the cold that had settled in his bones. As he sipped, his eyes wandered to a bulletin board near the counter. It was covered in faded photographs, faces of men, women, and children, each accompanied by the words missing in bold letters. His heart sank as he scanned the pictures, his breath catching when he spotted one that looked familiar. It was him. The photo was old, the edges yellowed and torn, but it was unmistakably him, wearing clothes he didn't recognize, standing in front of a house he'd never seen. Beneath his photo was a date, one that didn't make sense. It was from 10 years ago. "What is this?" Diego demanded, turning to the man. His voice trembled, the coffee sloshing in the cup as his hand shook. The old man didn't answer immediately. Instead, he leaned on the counter, his expression unreadable. "You've been on that road, haven't you?" he asked quietly. "The one they call the Lost Way." Diego's mouth went dry. "How do you know that?" The man's smile returned, colder this time. "Everyone who comes through here has. They think they've left it behind, but that road, it never really lets go. It keeps a piece of you. Sometimes it's a memory, sometimes it's more." Diego staggered back, his mind racing. "No," he whispered. "I escaped. I got out." "Did you?" the man asked, his tone almost mocking. He gestured toward the photo. That version of you thought the same thing. The room seemed to tilt, the walls closing in as Diego's heart pounded in his chest. The shadows in the corners of the gas station seemed darker now, deeper, and he could swear they were moving. The toy car in his pocket felt heavier, its edges digging into his skin like a warning. "I have to leave," Diego said, his voice barely audible. He turned toward the door, his hands shaking as he pushed it open. The night outside was different. The road was no longer straight but twisted, looping back on itself like a serpent eating its tail. The stars above had vanished, replaced by a blank, oppressive sky that seemed to press down on him. And in the distance, faint but unmistakable, he saw it, the silhouette of the inn, its gabled roof clawing at the heavens. Diego fell to his knees, his mind reeling as the whispers returned, louder than ever. "You never left," they hissed. "You never can." As the inn's lights flickered to life, casting their cold glow across the twisted road, Diego realized the truth. The Lost Way Inn wasn't just a place. It was a trap, a prison that existed outside of time, feeding on the fears and guilt of those who entered. And though he had fought, though he had tried to escape, he had never truly left. The gas station light flickered out, plunging the road into darkness. The last thing Diego saw before the shadows claimed him was the faint reflection of his face in the toy car's surface, a face twisted in fear, staring back at him with hollow eyes. The inn's doors opened, welcoming him back.